Okay, now to change, we're going to move into the second part of my lecture, and we're going to discuss very quickly, the U.S. women's rights movement, just to give us a bit of background. Traditionally, the U.S. women's rights movement is separated into three major movements called waves. The first wave was from 1792 to 1920. These are rough years. They didn't actually stop and start on the dime. The second wave was from 1963 to 1982. And the third wave began in 1991, and I'm very happy to say is still going strong today. So first wave feminism began in 1792 with the publication of Marie Wollstonecraft's treaty, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. The suffragists at the time, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret Fuller, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, they saw that in America, women legally did not have the same rights and protections as men. In law, women were not equal. Less than 100 years ago in the US, women didn't have the right to vote. Less than 100 years ago. It wasn't that long. So suffragists at the time of first wave feminism focused mainly on changing the legal rights of women and overturning legal inequalities. They fought for the right to vote and to equality in property laws, among others. One of, I'm sure you guys have learned about this, the Seneca Falls Convention. It was the first women's rights conference in the United States. The women, it was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And at the Seneca Falls Convention, they issued the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which demanded equality for women under the law. Now, this was incredibly shocking in the US at the time. Women were not supposed to behave this way. It was just horrible. Just a quote to give you how shocked people were. A newspaper at the time called the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments the most shocking and unnatural event ever recorded in the history of women. So I think that pretty much gives you a clue to what America thought of this at the time. But these women continued fighting, and eventually in 1920, because of this movement, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave women the right to vote. So women finally were allowed to vote the same as men. And when you guys see pictures of the suffragists at the time, to me they look so prim and proper in their beautiful dresses and their big hats, but it wasn't that kind of revolution. These women were assaulted, they were arrested, they were raped, they were humiliated, death threats. It was very, they were on the front lines of a revolution. They were put in jail, they lost their careers if they were lucky enough to have one at the time. So they were successful, and in 1920 we got the right to vote, and that's usually when we draw the line at the end of the first wave of feminism. So now second wave feminism began in 1963 and lasted about till 1982. Second wave feminism is pretty much started with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. This book looked at the notion at that time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in America that women were supposed to be housewives, that women found fulfillment in caring for their children, caring for their husband, and that was the highest, most lofty goal a woman could have, and that would make them happy. Well, Betty Friedan, in her book, she spoke to women, and she found out that they were miserable. They were unhappy. They weren't finding fulfillment and joy in doing this. And when she published this book, it was like wildfire across America because women realized they weren't alone. If I had thought that I was the only one that was unhappy, supposedly being fulfilled, cleaning and cooking for my family, I realized that so many other women felt the same way. And that book is what sparked the second wave. The second wave of feminism focused mainly on unofficial inequalities that women were suffering in the U.S., such as lack of equal opportunity to employment, the notion that women belong in the house, sexism in the workplace, as well as reproductive justice. Some of the main accomplishments of second wave feminism was in 1963 the Equal Pay Act. 1967 affirmative rights were extended to all women. In 1973 the Supreme Court made a decision in Roe v. Wade. They decided that most laws in the U.S. which had previously denied abortion were unconstitutional, they violated the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which gave you a constitutional right to privacy. So that was a major movement in the women's rights movement, but it's something that's still being hotly contested and fought over today, which you all know. The movement of second wave feminism is said to have ended in 1982 when the Equal Rights Amendment failed. This was first introduced into Congress in 1923, and it's been debated and debated ever since then. But the Equal Rights Amendment finally in 1982, it was never voted on, but it would have said that women couldn't be denied equal rights on account of sex. And it's still being debated today. In the mid-1980s, there was also a backlash against the feminist movement in the U.S. And, before I move on, I just want to say something about second wave feminism. One of the criticisms that it often faces is that it was a very white, middle-class movement. These women had their hearts in the right places, but it was a very exclusive movement. It focused on white, educated women and the problems that they were facing. It didn't take into account women of color, gay and transgendered women, differently abled women. It focused white, educated women. In 1991, it was the start of third wave feminism, which tried to address some of these shortcomings of second wave feminism. In 1991 is when it began. In 1992 was a very seminal moment in this part of the movement. It was the publication of Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth. And this was a book which critiqued the mass marketing of women's beauty in the U.S. She revealed that women in the U.S. were taught, you know what matters about you? It matters that you wear makeup, you wear short skirts, you look sexy constantly all the time. And it diverted and sucked women's money and time and their thoughts away from politics, education, doing things that mattered, and made them obsessed with the way they looked. And this book was a critique of that. So like I mentioned before, this movement tried to address some of the shortcomings of the second wave of feminism. So it's very, very diverse. It tries very hard to be inclusive of all kinds of women. It recognizes that as a white woman, I don't experience the same kind of sexism that you as an Arab woman experience, or that someone else as a lesbian woman experiences, or someone that's a handicapped woman experiences. We all experience it in different ways, and this movement tries to recognize and respect that. Like I mentioned, we're still defending reproductive justice. Since 1973, the decision of Roe v. Wade, slowly our reproductive rights are being taken away from us, so the women are fighting to keep a hold of that and the sovereignty over our own body. Third wave feminism also fights against rape culture, which is the glorification of sexual violence against women, which is rampant in the media, especially in the U.S. The degrading representation of women in the media. Women are shown only as sex objects, something to be consumed by men and not individual people in their own right. The eroticization of purity, innocence, and virginity. This is a very, very disturbing trend in America today. Like I mentioned before, women in the States are told you are how you look. You have to be sexy all the time, and you have to look sexy all the time. But at the same time in the States, just like most places in the world, if a woman has sex, she's considered to be a slut. You know, and a man has sex, he's a hero. The woman is supposed to be a virgin and supposed to be looking sexy but never acting on her urges. So the sexiest thing is a pure, innocent virgin, which if you think about it for a second is incredibly dangerous. Incredibly dangerous. It almost glorifies pedophilia, childlike innocence. It's something that I'm very interested in and write about a lot, so I'll move on. Something else that third wave feminism focuses on is the corporate glass ceiling, which we've all heard about. Women now have a bit easier time entering the workplace in the US. But a lot of times they rise up through the ranks, getting promotions until they reach a certain point, and then they're stuck. They can see through the ceiling, they can see the CEO, they can see jobs that they could have, but something keeps them down, being a woman and not wanting to be promoted because of being a woman.